From the coffee break. I hope you have an enjoyable coffee break with lots of networking and talking, which is always important on these conferences as well, as we are in a dialogue, and the dialogue, as we know, takes place on many levels, not only on the official ones, but as well from person to person, and I think this is quite important. I'd like to welcome you to this panel on self-regulation. And I consider self-regulation as a key instrument for the questions that we are discussing here. We had yesterday lots of talk about the necessity of a balance between the freedom of the media and the responsibility of the media. And I say that self-regulation is a key instrument for this balance, the self-regulation which is coming out of the industry and not from the state. But self-regulation is really double-sided. On the one hand, it requires a high amount of professionalism among the journalists and the media persons who do self-regulation, but on the other hand, and this is why I have always as well a sort of optimistic look on self-regulation, it contributes a lot to the professionalization of media and journalism. In times of conflict, professionalism is even in times of conflict, self-regulation is even more challenging, and in volatile environments as well. And on the other hand, we can say it is even more needed in times of conflict and volatile environments. How this can be done, what are the challenges, how we can do this, I want to explore here with you and our distinguished guests on the panel during this panel. Our guests are here to my left. This is Inga Sikorskaya, who is the founder and the director of the School of Peacemaking and Media Technology in Central Asia. And she has a lot of experiences in this field, working on many media and training as well. Then we have Diana Dudzik, who is a member of the Independent Media Council in Ukraine, and she is the director of the NGO Detector Media. And we have Bent Nurbi Bonde, who is the director of Media Progress, an organization who is working on preventing conflicts, on peace building, and he has a lot of experience in over more than 50 countries in these processes. And these are our guests. I want to start with a very fundamental question to our guests, and this is the question: to what extent is it possible to maintain journalistic standards in times of conflict, of violent conflict, hot conflicts, or as well conflicts of low intensity? So Inga, would you like to start with this idea?
Thank you. Спасибо, Barbara.
Thank you, Barbara. I will speak in Russian. As regards self-regulation, in Kyrgyzstan, organization works on Central Asia. We had some experience during 2010 with regard to ethnic violence, and after the revolution in Kyrgyzstan, where we had ethnic violence between ethnic Uzbeks. There were many victims, and this is when we came up against the problem where none of the standards were actually working. The journalists tried to defend their own ethnic position, and they provided information from that viewpoint. But after a rather short period, when we came to the conclusion that the country was soon going to crash, we decided to introduce self-regulation programs and to create a multinational journalist approach using the experience from all over the world, where we try to get objective information from areas where there were lots of conflicts, but trying to get all sources of information. It was complex, it was difficult, we weren't always successful, but we did realize that during the conflict period, this was the best option. And a little bit later on, a few months after, we realized that in fact this approach worked. Today, when I heard discussions about what should we do, now this situation I'm talking about was in 2010, so many years on, we've seen that everything has changed, and I think that journalism standards, to keep these standards up during times of conflict is a very difficult thing to do, because in areas of conflict you have to be self-regulating. So if the journalists in these conflicts don't want to self-regulate, that you can't really do anything. So up to a certain level, you can use standards of journalism. You have to do that. But if you can't do that yourself, then others will try to regulate you from outside. So we must have self-regulation. So there are still very many mechanisms we could try to find. We can't say that everything's already been tried. Perhaps Diana can add to the different challenges that we've faced with regard to self-regulation.
Let me ask a question to that. You said it is if journalists don't want self-regulation, you can't do anything, but you managed finally to do it. So what were the arguments, what were the experiences that the journalists in your region said, yeah, we want to do that and we adhere to it?
When journalists understood that for them as representatives of specific ethnic groups, this was an inter-ethnic conflict, when they realized that they are facing the same threat, and when they understood that this can split the country in two, and when the journalists understood that they had no choice, they had no other options, because these journalists wanted to live together with other people in the same country. So basically, they pertain to their reason. This was a domestic internal conflict, not an international one. So now we are trying to assess this question, and this is where we realize that self-regulation played the decisive role, because it focused more on safety and security for the journalists themselves, who wanted to live and work in the same country and to provide objective information to their audience inside the country. Now, it's good that we don't have any experience from international conflicts, and I can't say anything about that, but based on the conflict that we went through, I think that we can have some lessons learned from this. We have done some research, and we've seen how self-regulation instruments are used in peacetime, in more peaceful situations. Although, of course, as I've said, everything has changed, and the ways that journalists are pressured is different now, and the journalists themselves have also changed. But at the same time, we were able to use these methods, and we had some success in doing that.
Thank you. Diana, your NGO Detector Media has conducted research concerning the professional standards of journalism. Can you talk a little bit about these results of your research in answering to my question, to what extent is it possible to maintain these standards in times of conflict?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk about this. It's a very important issue with regard to regulation in general. At the same time, as Barbara said, it's very complex. When we talk about standards and regulation during time of war, any conflict and wars are multiple contexts. It's not a black and white picture. And an objective information is not just looking at the actual facts, but it's understanding the context and many contexts that often overlap. So since often the actual facts are placed in the wrong context, and this can distort the reality as well. And it could be even worse than fake news. After Crimea was annexed by Russia and the beginning of the aggression in the east, Ukrainian journalists found themselves in a very difficult situation. for the first time, in fact, since independence. And this was a situation of pressure that everyone was able to overcome. On the one hand, you have professional standards, the profession, the requirement to follow these standards. And on the other hand, there is the desire on the part of the journalists not to harm the people in the country where they live or any sides to the conflict. So from the beginning of the war in the East and the annexation of Crimea, amongst journalists, we had a very serious debate with regard to journalism standards and how to report on the information. And this debate is still ongoing. And I would even say that it is thanks to the discussion, also sometimes it's a very emotional discussion, we've been able to safeguard the profession of journalism as it is now in my country. So just reacting to all of these challenges and our debate, my organization, Detector Media, conducted a survey. It was called "How Do Ukrainian Journalists See Their Role in Reporting on Conflicts?" This is a survey we held thanks to the support of the OSCE, for which we would like to thank them. And what did we observe in this survey? What impacts the journalists' understanding of their own role in a time of war? This is very important when we talk about how journalists behave themselves and what they do. I would like to also point out that there is a difference between how journalists report on conflict or a war, which is in their own country, and how they report on wars in other countries. So these are two different things, two different ways of apprehending the situation, understanding what's going on. So we asked 42 editorial boards and media, TV and press, regional ones, and all journalists focused on the fact that they're under great pressure from the emotional stress under which they are working. On the other hand, they feel very much involved emotionally in all of the conflicts in the country and the feeling of threat and danger in the country. And this kind of transfers to journalists' own lives and their own families. All of these factors impact how journalists report on what is going on in the country. And in this context, it's very difficult for journalists to distance themselves from what's going on and to be above the fray, to be neutral. So when we try to understand what types of approaches journalists have in covering the war in the East, we saw that there were three groups of journalists in our country. One group were more patriotic journalists who focus on presenting only the Ukrainian side of the argument, the Ukrainian position, and who don't use the journalism standards in fighting propaganda in Russia. Then we have neutral journalists whose standards are highest of all, and they very strictly follow these standards, and they maintain neutrality. And the third group is the biggest group. This is a mixed group. This is when journalists, on the one hand, understand the importance of maintaining journalism standards. They partly follow these standards, but sometimes it's also important not to cause harm to the military of Ukraine or other groups who are somehow involved in the conflict. This also impacts on their way of telling about everything that's going on and reporting on the situation. So all of the different challenges we are facing, well, if you have questions on more detailed results of our survey, I'll try to answer you. But everything happening in my country starting from 2014 and the debate that was born of this pushed the media community and media organizations and broadcasters to create this self-regulating body. I'm also a member of that. This is the Independent Media Union. It was created by 5 key media organizations in Ukraine.
Later on to this institution of self-regulation, I just want to ask, I mean, it's very interesting to have here with the research some evidence-based knowledge on what is going on, but from many of these researchers, we know that there is a big difference between the role concept, the self-concept of journalists that they have and the way how they behave. And there are many reasons for that you addressed already. But could you tell a little bit more if you have research as well, not only on the self-concept, but how the self-concept is translated into the way how they do reporting?
Mm-hmm.
As a result of our survey, we realized that, in fact, most of the editions don't have an institutionalized type of standard. There is no internal code of conduct or charter that determines how journalists work in conflict or difficult situations. And in this situation, the majority of journalists we asked basically were guided by their own experience or skills or knowledge. They didn't really have any kind of handbook or guide from their editorial board to understand how they should be working. So this is the biggest problem, in fact, that we have today. So we started to say that, in fact, we would need to develop some kind of document or code of conduct that could be used by journalists when they work in these difficult circumstances. There were attempts in Ukraine. I've said already, we have a lot of debate, very lively debates. We have roundtables where journalists meet and discuss these issues. There were attempts to elaborate some shared positions on these issues. At the beginning of the conflict, we talked about terminology. We raised other issues for discussion, but there isn't one single approach to this. And this is a problem for media as well, because from the very beginning, we also said that the government can't impose rules to journalists and how they work. The journalists need to think about this themselves and to develop some kind of approach when they report on these difficult situations in time of conflict.
Bent, you have a lot of experiences in very different countries about peace building and conflict resolution. So from the background of this experience, how would you answer to this question? To what extent is it possible to maintain journalistic standards in times of conflict?
Well, I'm not too optimistic. It's very difficult indeed. You had conflicts where you saw U.S. Involved in conflicts. You saw U.S. has some excellent code of ethics for journalists, for editors, for media, and yet the journalists tended to be patriots, reporting on the Gulf Wars. They tended also, because there was money in being patriotic media, the media also tended to lean that way. You see the same in practically all conflicts, that is very, very difficult for the journalist alone to take a position as neutral. It's very difficult because you're under pressure from your politicians, you're under pressure from the public that by definition, of course, is in favor of its own side in an internal conflict or of its own country in an international conflict. And therefore self-regulation per se should in my view be co-regulation. In a state of conflict, I believe much more in going across the conflict. For example, I learned yesterday that at Cyprus, the journalist unions work very closely together on developing common code of ethics for Cyprus, for all Cyprus, and hopefully also could be a regulatory body, a self-regulatory body that appears out of that. I experienced in the Balkans, where I really have worked a lot since 1999, that right after the conflicts, in a country like Croatia, you would only see 3% of the programs on the public television were programs from the neighboring countries. Because of the conflict, you simply kept it away. So what you need to do, in my view, is to work together across the conflict boundaries. It is to make sure that your politicians do not engage in the work of the regulatory body, but actually commit to the work of the self-regulatory body. For example, I did a survey of all EU member states and the regulatory bodies there. There were very few countries where you had self-regulatory bodies where the financing, where the commitment and where the start-up of the regulatory body came from the media and the journalists, but most were a mixture of. Then the state made the legislation on the self-regulatory body, then the state gave money to it. So even if it in its function appeared pretty independent, the boards in the different countries were supported by the state. And I don't think, that's actually a lesson after a quite long life, that I don't think it's possible to obtain a lot of progress unless you have commitment from the politicians also. If you want to have independent media, the politicians have to respect it. And you can't do it alone. There's money, there's politics, there's pressure, there's violence, as we heard in the last panel. You need to have a respect for the work you do as independent. Then it's possible to improve, but it's not easy.
So the necessity, it's nearly a paradox or contradictory, that the engagement of the government should be not to engage, so just to give the frame, but not to involve. So what were the experiences with the setting up of the self-regulation in your country that you had and in the neighboring countries? How did it work? They thought we do it as a media and professionals, and how did the government behave to that?
Я думаю, если
Well, in Central Asian countries, the situation is a bit different. One of our media surveys in recent years has focused on several challenges. One of them is hard censorship and self-censorship. And this shows that the government or political circles would support self-regulation is something which is laughable, in fact, because, you know, the one who is basically supporting or paying is the one who is giving the orders. And now, after the period of time where we have had some experience in the post-conflict period, but everything has changed, and political trends in the world have also changed, and this has had a major impact on us. For example, not all media know about any kind of code of ethics, and what's more important now are completely different ideas and concepts in the world of journalism. In the pre-election period, of course, there could be some kind of self-regulating body that would be supported by the authorities and political forces, and that may seem that that would be fine, but when a new political party comes to power, then everything may change. That's also a trend that we've seen. I wanted to focus on some of the challenges that stand in the way of a traditional type of self-regulation. And in a period when journalism is under fire and it is its importance is reducing, we need to develop some new mechanism. Now, if we talk about challenges in Central Asia, well, there's more censorship, there's more control of journalism. It's different in different countries in Central Asia, but it depends on the situation. When you have censorship and pressure, you can't turn to self-regulation. It's just not going to work. For example, in Kyrgyzstan, we have seen a reduction of freedom in recent years. For 3 months, there have been certain challenges and claims against journalists. So people are being censored, and there's fear among journalists because they are being attacked legally, I mean. So in Kazakhstan, for example, what they call a government investment in media, when media have state financial support, of course, they would then have a positive reporting on all government programs. And in that situation, nobody needs to regulate anything. Basically, the journalists are paid to report in a way that the government wants them to report. That's also a challenge. And this is what our journalist in the region said is the main problem, the main challenge for us. What about Uzbekistan, where we still have the strictest kind of censorship and repression? Independent journalists are completely lacking in the country. Either they have died or they're in prisons, or they have obtained political asylum and have left the country. We have one journalist here who for 7 years did not have the right to leave the country. He was blacklisted. He was blacklisted and he was jailed due to some false facts, and we were able to release him thanks to OSCE. Sergei Naumov is here with us today, and he was able to come and travel here for the first time in many years, and he just can't get enough freedom here today. Now, in these countries, there is no opportunity to develop journalism. And in these difficult situations, journalists don't think about self-regulation. They are thinking first and foremost about their own physical safety. Other challenges in Central Asia is the practice of using the laws against instigating violence to shut journalisms up. This is something that started 2 years ago. Well, in the world when we have hatred and homophobia and inflow of massive refugees, hate speech rose and really evolved. And this tendency was also implemented in Central Asia. And so all of a sudden, we see a lot of people being charged with instigating violence and hatred against journalists. The human rights defenders say that these are trumped-up charges. Just last year, a journalist was charged with instigating hatred due to one of his articles. So this is also a question of self-regulation, because journalists have to care about their own safety and security because they are inside the country and they stand the most to lose. The third challenge is the highest level of Russian propaganda in Central Asian countries, especially in those countries that are part of the Eurasian Economic Union, which is managed by Russia. This level of propaganda has always been high, but we are facing an unprecedented pressure right now in the information area and end of 2014 and 2015. Of course, after Crimea was annexed, what happened is that the public was really divided in Kyrgyzstan as well. When we had a survey, we were surprised to find out that basically it's like 50-50 with regard to those who use information, those who are under Russian propaganda with regard to the conflict in Crimea, and those who get their information from the internet. They were much better informed. And don't forget that the level of internet penetration is about 40% in my country, and the leading media is still television, and local TV is very limited. There is not enough alternative information in local languages, and mostly people consume information in Russian. Everyone turned out to be under this influence of the Russian media. And so local journalists and local TV channels don't have independent reporting on the conflict in Ukraine. They just retransmitted what they got from Russian television. And a couple of months after that, some NGOs got together and put together a project, put together a group of journalists, sent them to Ukraine so that they should get the information firsthand and get some objective reporting done. But the local media weren't able to do this. They couldn't send their journalists there and reporters there due to different reasons. Censorship, not enough funding, and they continue to retransmit Russian sources of information. I'm just going to end now. So I just wanted to say that, well, the fourth challenge, yes, very comprehensive one, is the high level of the language and terms of enmity and hatred. This also influences journalism because experts have said that we need to create our own standards and norms. Of course, using the language of enmity is used differently in different contexts, but what do we need to focus at is that they're trying to crack down. They're trying to not use terms or words that would fan the flames of hatred. This is also something that journalists have to keep in mind. So this is the situation with regard to local media and journalists. They're kind of depressed because they are fighting censorship. They are trying to fight for their own safety. They're trying to maintain their freedom to move around. And the issue of self-regulation, we asked them, for example, do you use codes of conduct or ethics? How do you report on safety and terrorism, for example? And many said they forgot all about the existence of a code of conduct or a code of ethics. So that's just briefly on the situation. Thank you.
Diana, I picked up this demand of BAN to say that governments should stay away but promote self-regulation. So what were your experiences in Ukraine with self-regulation and the role of government indeed?
Знаете, я сейчас
I just listened to my colleague, and I was thinking that things are not as bad as we sometimes think back home. In Ukraine, we have a very particular situation on these topics. I said that the media space itself is thinking on its own internally on the most difficult issues. On the other hand, there was a kind of driver of these new reforms, including in media, is not the government, but the drivers are NGOs, civil society. It is NGOs quite often are the ones who put forward important issues up for discussion. And even on the issue of self-regulation, well, I mentioned the independent media organization that was created without any government support. They weren't involved at all. It was created by the top 5 media organizations in Ukraine that have been around for a long time. They have their own influence in media, and the media industry, first of all, was observing all of this from the sidelines. But when the work actually got off the ground and when the Media Council started to look into specific cases of violating standards or infringement of laws, then their work turned out to be very much in demand. So we've been around for over a year. Yuri Artemenko is with us today. He heads the National Oversight Council on TV and Broadcasting. Quite often sends cases and complaints to us. So we try to look into these complaints against the media. Bent mentioned financing. So if the government is financing media, then they have their impact. Our Independent Media Council is not financed by the government. We have 15 members who are volunteers. They are not funded by anyone. But we do have 2 lawyers that put out their legal opinions, and they have grants and donor funds that are provided to us for their work. The situation in Ukraine is quite unique also because we have a number of media organizations, including ours, that has been monitoring the information space for many years. We don't just produce monitoring, but looking to see how journalists respect standards in reporting on news. For example, we monitor all of the 7 key TV channels of the country, the ones that have the highest ratings. We also produce monitoring on the situation in the regions. So we show the full picture. And so we say the journalists from this channel did not follow the standards on these topics. These journalists did not respect standards on these other topics, for example. The media industry, in spite of the fact that it doesn't like to be criticized, it still does respond to the results of our monitoring efforts. And we've seen how this monitoring can make a difference when we were reforming our state TV channel into a public broadcaster, because the monitoring we conducted meant that all the regional TV changed their approach to news. And based on this monitoring, we were able to shed light on the weak points in how the newsroom works with content. So this is why I'm saying that if you actually look at the experience in Europe, and Detektor Media's site, our site, is now publishing this information. We have a local project with another media organization. You can see it on our site. We publish the experience of some key European countries on issues of self-regulation. Of course, Ukraine has chosen a bit of a different path because it is the public media organizations that are the drivers. It's the NGOs that drive this process. But the media is heeding our advice, and the government organizations are as well.
Thank you. Bent, we heard already a lot about how difficult it is for journalists to maintain standards and to be neutral. We know how difficult all this is. But on the other hand, there are lots of concepts like the famous concept of peace journalism or similar ones which are out there. Are they realistic, or are they, let's say, over-asking, over-demanding by the journalists, or do they even conflict with some other necessities of journalistic profession? So what do you think about such concepts which try to describe what journalists in a conflict should be about?
Yeah, if I first may say that I'm of course happy for every good experience we hear from our distinguished speakers, but I must also say that I read several reports from several sides about the media situation, including in Ukraine, and it's not easy to be fair and say that everything is as it should be. On the peace journalism, I think is critical, is extremely important, especially in these times, that we must ensure that journalism as such is factually based, is not biased, it's balanced, it's professional, and always also after a possible peace and after a lasting peace and a democracy also remains the same standard, if I may say so. If we promote peace journalism, which I'm not in favor of, I must admit, then we say that if a journalist can promote peace, that we are all good friends and we should do all we could and we should not look at it this way and that way, then who will trust that journalist or that media after the war, after the conflict? We need to have the same standards all the time. What is important, again, in my opinion, is that, let me give an example. In Afghanistan, where you had 23 years of war, we assisted right after the war, the public broadcaster with the 2 hours daily news programming. And we said one thing to the journalists all the time: you don't make one single report where you don't listen to both sides of that story. And that's both of the story and of the conflict. And if you live in Ukraine, you listen and you make stories about the conflict with the disputed areas, then you listen to both sides. That's the way you can build trust. That's the way you can build a balance. And I think that's a key of everything, that we have 2 sides or more sides in a conflict, and we should listen to all of them. And then, of course, not to make it, stay away from making it a football match with who's moving forward and who's moving backward and who scores goals. This is much too serious to do that. We need to go down. That's my advice, I would say.
Is this perspective, I mean, this is finally to look at the basic journalistic competences, look at all sides, look at behind the scenes, look at the differentiation, the diversity of a situation, which can make as well a first step into a solution of a conflict. Would you say that there are tendencies of journalists in your countries that understand their journalistic role in a conflict like that?
In this type of conflict, traditionally, the right standards of journalism is not something that has been done away with. You need to have 2 points of view. You need to check the facts. This is world journalism standards. We've always talked about this. I don't know why in recent years people have tended to forget about this. Is that you need to have balanced, objective information is the normal situation for journalists. But journalists do realize they need to follow these rules. But when they are under pressure of certain factors that I already talked about, under this pressure, we see absolutely horrible reporting. We sometimes see very serious distortions. You have to remember that in my country and journalists in Central Asia are facing a major problem with regard to standards overall. A part of it is due to the fact that freedom for a long period of time was suppressed, and traditional journalism was basically squeezed out for a long time. In Kyrgyzstan, there were periods where some objective journalism was in the forefront, where facts were checked, we had balanced points of view, but now we are in a post-fact society, in the society and in a world where fake news is in the forefront. But we need to observe this, and we need to fight for balanced and objective information reporting. If we don't do this, then instead of honest journalists, we're going to have more propaganda. And we will lose our responsibility and the prestige of journalism as a profession. I'm convinced that the standards have always been around. They will continue to be around, but we need to make sure that we make every effort to respect them. And in that way, we won't have to create additional resources to check facts. What we've talked about a lot recently is due to this fake news phenomena. I think fake news has always been around. It's just that in the digital age, we have a lot more of it through the internet. But everyone is supposed to check the facts. This is what we should continue to do. Balanced, objective journalists exist everywhere, but the challenges I mentioned do have an impact on journalists to a lesser or greater extent. The journalists who live in countries where there is repression, their hands are tied, basically. There are certain things that they just cannot do in those countries.
I want to pick up this idea and ask you, Diana, as Bent was a little bit challenging, the situation not being that rosy in Ukraine, as well Sergei Tomilenko said it's only a partly free press. So how would you say is this tension between having the necessity of a free press for doing self-regulation and the fact that it is not that as you want to have it?
Ну,
Yes, as an organization that covers a lot what's happening in our media, we have a very critical assessment of the situation itself. Our media belong to oligarchs. Often they support the interests of the owners when they report the news as well. But in a certain sense, it is thanks to the fact that some key groups belong to different oligarchs and different political oligarch groups that see the situation from different angles, and they see the future of the country from different angles. In the media space, we have a kind of pluralism, Ukrainian style. And so our citizens can look at different media sources and get a different picture of what's happening in the country and in the world. But if we talk about journalism in the world as it stands today, what direction are we moving in? And is that something which is actually even possible? Well, this kind of global journalism is getting away from this language of hatred and enmity. In Ukraine, there's a big difference between what we see with regard to this language of enmity on TV channels, and I'm talking about the news programs only, because if we're talking about a talk show or some kind of entertainment show, something a bit different. So basically, when we look at the news, we haven't seen through our monitoring a high level of this language or of enmity and hatred. But we do have a big problem, our social media networks. And the discussions in social networks, even among journalists, is very emotional. Very often it becomes very personal. And that kind of language of enmity and hatred is present there. So this is a problem we need to discuss first. And recently, there was a number of famous journalists in Ukraine and NGOs thought about debating the level, the culture of this type of difficult discussion. This is something we're going to discuss quite openly, I think.
Anna, I would like now open our discussion to the floor, and perhaps allow me to ask you, might be we could in our discussion put the focus on ideas how really precisely self-regulation can be put forward, can be promoted, can be established, and we have to look at the challenges, as I know, but might be this way forward could direct a little bit our discussion. And I go, as I think this was the first, Mr. Van there, and this one. Okay? And I follow this wonderful rule with this 2 minutes mechanism here.
Hello, I'm Christos Christofidis from the Union of Cyprus Journalists and also a member of the Press Council in Cyprus. I have to say that from my experience, self-regulation is having some very, very difficulties these days. Due to the economic crisis, the level of the journalism has dropped. And actually there is, I don't know if you know about AIPSE, it's an umbrella of press councils in Europe. There is a big discussion these years to change from self-regulation to, let's call it, co-regulation. I mean, if self-regulation does not pay to be a secondary body that can punish the journalists or the media. Because self-regulation does not work anymore, I think so. I'm afraid so. Thank you.
And here was... We had the next, this one, yeah?
Да, спасибо. Я Алексей
Alexei Tsuka, the Donetsk Information Institute. We in Ukraine, we are in Ukraine, we live there, we can move around freely, etc. But journalists who have to work in media outlets that in territories that are no longer controlled by Ukraine, and they call themselves Republican media. Now, these media and the way they work, they are media, maybe not in our sense, but they're still media. But are they covered by human rights organizations and media monitoring organizations that provide for the rights and opportunities, the rights of journalists and opportunities for them to change? Because our Ukrainian journalists, for example, they may be to the left or to the right or liberals or conservatives or whatever, but they have an opportunity to change the way they work because we have an opportunity to have a dialogue and discussion. What about the journalists who are in Donetsk or Lugansk, in areas where there's a very strict censorship and very radical requirements from local authorities, and they do not have any opportunity to be objective and to use the methods of independent journalism? Nevertheless, these people are kind of locked in. On the one hand, we don't let them enter our discussions because we consider them to be separatists. And on the other hand, the Russians who use effective control in those territories and also cannot ensure that these colleagues have any kind of protection because these territories are not recognized in the area as having any kind of legal liability or responsibility. Perhaps it is up to our Russian colleagues to take some responsibility for these journalists. Perhaps there are organizations, Russian organizations, that could work with the journalists there in order to change their way of working and provide them for some standards to have an objective coverage. Thank you.
Next to you was the next one.
Thank you. I'm Marina Beskorovina from OSCE Project Coordinator in Ukraine. And my question will be partially in a continuation of the line with relationship with the state and partially with regard to the positioning of the self-regulation entities. What would be, especially within the context of the crisis of conflict situations, what would be the right role for the self-regulatory body? Should it be kind of a overseen body highlighting the violations of codes and other ethical norms, or should it be rather uniting platforms? Should it act as a place where everyone can meet around some uniting principles and values? And in case of the latter, how do you build your image in a way that that media community is complies with your decisions and complies with what you're suggesting to them? Thank you.
Thank you. If you agree, I would like to take the questions for our final round and go along the plenary further on, that we have many voices. Okay, so the next one was this guy, you with the beard.
Thank you, ma'am. Alexei Panich, National Public Broadcasting Company of Ukraine. I have a question to the panelists regarding the applicability of universal standards to different or asymmetrical situations, like, for example, Russian-Ukrainian conflict. Because, if you have two groups of armed civilians in conflict, you deal with the groups. If you have two authoritarian states in conflict, you deal with the leaders of the states. Now, in this case, we have Ukraine is represented by the civil society, a group of people who feel themselves an independent nation, and from Russian side, you have a state which, because of its imperialistic ambitions, does not recognize this group as a separate nation. Now, what happens, as a result, in Ukraine, civil society actually limits the power of the state, whereas in Ukraine, in Russia, state limits the power of civil society, if any exists at all. Now, what happens when you try to apply the universal standards to such a situation? You say, let's switch to peace talk, let's refuse from the hate speech. From the side of the civil society, you have either sincere attempt or refusal. But in fact, if we attempt to switch to peace talk, it looks like a unilateral ceasefire declaration. Because from the Russian side, journalists are not as much free to follow the same line. They may privately agree with whatever you want, but when they do their job, they are limited by the state harshly. They are either follow the state line, or they are out of profession, or just push it to some margins of their profession. So do you feel the problem here? It's a long story from the Greek philosophy that equal treatment of unequal partners is very unjust. Do you see the injustice here? Do you see the problem here? Thank you.
Thank you. That's
Thank you, Nadezhda Ashgikhin, European Federation of Journalists. I am very grateful for Bent for reminding Afghanistan. It's an old conflict and many journalists have been covered it. And I had a colleague who was covering conflict from Soviet side, Vladimir Snegiryov, a war correspondent, who was, of course, representing Komsomolskaya Pravda newspaper. It was a time of Soviet, it was a time of propaganda. There was no any freedom of the media in Soviet time that moment. So he was covering Afghan conflict from Russian side. And he knew about another journalist who was covering the conflict from another side. His name was Rory Peck. They knew about each other, and very soon after the conflict they became close friends. They went to Iraq, they went to Afghanistan, and they supported each other until murder of Rory Peck in Moscow in 1993. Why they managed to do that? Because they didn't lie. They did their job. But we do not forget, we shouldn't forget that journalism is a profession of everyday choice. Each of us makes his or her choice every day, during conflict, during censorship, during all circumstances. I'm very grateful that we have today discussion about journalism, not just some general judgment, but journalism is a very special profession, and personal choice and personal responsibility for our job is number one. And if we are talking about self-regulation, don't forget that any perfect, the best in the world, codes of ethics, codes of conduct would never provide us real responsibility of the media if journalists, each of us, it's a very special profession, and our community would not stand for this issue as a real value. And I think we have a chance. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. I have the next colleague back there on the left. Yes, please.
Спасибо.
Thank you. It seems to me that we had a question. I'm Peter Fedorov. You may remember me from yesterday. I spoke yesterday. It seems to me there was a question here to Russian journalists with regard to wouldn't the Russian authorities influence a journalist in Donetsk, Lugansk? No, we won't, because we recognize the integrity of Ukraine, the independence of Ukraine. We acknowledge the need to implement the Minsk agreements, in the framework of which there is an appeal for dialogue between Kiev and the authorities in Donetsk and Lugansk. This is why this is an internal problem for Ukraine. We would be very happy if this dialogue would get off the ground. We will be very happy if Ukrainian colleagues would stop talking about this as of us and them. They should just speak about ourselves, Ukrainians who live outside of the conflict zone, and those who live inside these territories that are called separatist territories. As regards Russian propaganda in Kyrgyzia, I have a question on this front to one of the panelists. Just a few words of introduction. The Russian channels that are broadcast outside of Russia are not channels that are created especially for that. In RTR Planeta, this is the Culture Channel and the Channel One, the main broadcaster of our holding. And we combine these two, and this is what we broadcast. We don't do this for money. On the contrary, we earn money through our broadcasting, and we only broadcast in areas where people want to see our programs and are prepared to pay through this, through cable operators or satellite dishes. Now, what do you call propaganda? It's not something that we formulate for Kyrgyzstan. This is just information that other countries want to see. Thank you.
Thank you. I have 3 more questions, and then I want to finalize, and please keep you brief because I want to have a last round on the panel. So the next colleague is you.
Anton Stulik.
Anton Stulikov, I represent the Sverdlovsk regional television. We are located in the Ural region, right in the center of the country. For me, it's absurd to hear that we could have discussions about professional journalism standards. I started my journalism career in Kommersant, the newspaper, and before that, I even took part in our Ukrainian version. I've always been taught there is no second point of view, and there is no comment, project, or program or subject. Everything is very clear. It's a question also of the safety and security of journalists, because if you present 2 points of view, then nobody's going to feel slighted. So once again, it's absurd to talk about this. You need to present 2 points of view, and in the editor-in-chief's office, we have a very simple slogan. When you say that you tried to call but you never got through, it'll cost you 1,000 rubles. This is a very good rule of thumb and a very good way of motivating journalists. And also, I heard that we don't have friends with journalists. We're not. Well, from when I worked in Kiev, I still have many friends who are journalists. When we hear all of this about propaganda, contra-propaganda, we sit together and we say, these people are crazy. On the other hand, I get the clear feeling that this language of hatred, of enmity, wouldn't be around if we didn't have artificial limitations of channels, closing of borders. You know, just one brief example. A month and a half ago in Sevastopol, there was a major TV festival that a naive European Belgian came to visit, Peter Jean Depew, and he introduced a great film there about children in Afghanistan. I say naive because he wanted to get there by going through Ukraine. And so, of course, he didn't get through. And if this kind of idiocy was less around, then we wouldn't have so much hatred. Thank you.
Thank you. There was you? No, he did not. Then it is you.
Just very brief response to the person who spoke a little bit earlier on. With regard to the internal Ukrainian conflict, very briefly, if you pull out your weapons and arms from Ukraine, stop delivering modern armaments, then we would no longer have a conflict. Stop interfering in the affairs of other countries.
I want to finalize this because there are so many questions, and I want to give the floor still the occasion to answer to these questions. So pick up these questions that you find important, and please, perhaps you can as well say some words what you think is necessary for bringing forward self-regulation in your countries. I start again with you, Inga, and then we go on.
I will try to answer the representative of RTR on what we call propaganda. I'm not saying that this is a propaganda that you're creating specifically for Kyrgyzstan. What we call propaganda is an imbalanced way of reporting, where this type of standard is common in Russia, and then that is spread around. But in media monitoring, we have done monitoring on the language of hatred, and we have created we have seen, in fact, that there were very specific stories from Russia during the independence of Kyrgyzstan and after that, where the Russian channels showed things that did not exist. This is documented, and that was propaganda. So that was specifically created for that. But after that, it's just an imbalanced view of journalism. So there was a question here about a journalist cannot be journalism is personal, that it needs to be a personal kind of regulation. Then there was someone from Cyprus who talked about self-regulation, and for that you need to have co-regulation, kind of regulation. Well, that's an interesting approach. Perhaps that's something that we actually should develop more, because as we've seen, in certain situations, self-regulation breaks down, but co-regulation, if you're talking about joint regulation from different countries, an intergovernmental body, it would be important to flesh all of that out. Maybe you can explain to me exactly what you mean. We can talk about it outside of this conference, but I think it's a good idea. I don't know what else I can answer, because there are a lot of comments. Maybe over to Diana.
Before I move on to you, I'm very sorry. I overlooked one colleague that we had, Sergei Pomilenko, that I overlooked your voice. So please go on, and then we go ahead.
Thank you, colleagues. I wanted to just say something at the end of the panel's discussion to inform something very important, some news in the context of our conference and with regard to safety and security of journalists. I wanted to thank the head of the Journalist Union from Russia. We agreed our joint statement expressing solidarity with our colleague Stanislav Maseyev, who disappeared in Donetsk, and I'm just going to read out this text. It is a joint statement of the Russian and your journalists. The representatives of journalism organizations and the Russian Federation Union of Journalists of Russia, participants in the International Conference OSCE on Media Freedom and Stability, are concerned with the fate of Stanislav Maseyev. On the 2nd of June 2017, it became known that in Donetsk, a famous journalist and blogger and publicist and writer, Stanislav Maseyev, known as Stanislav Vasin, disappeared. Unfortunately, no one has claimed responsibility for his disappearance, and official statements on where he is to be found have not appeared. However, there is a high probability that journalist Maseyev, as a professional, has been detained by the representatives of the so-called Donetsk National People's Republic. The international community is called upon to make every effort to find out what happened to our colleague Stanislav Maseyev and to release him. I would like to thank everyone for the fact that the draft was written by Valery Makeyev, our colleague, who himself was held for 100 days as prisoner. This was a draft he proposed, and we agreed this text over the past 2 days. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this important declaration, and still two more very brief comments from our distinguished panelists from Diana and Bent, and I would ask the translators just to keep this on.
Just a couple of words about co-regulation. Perhaps in Ukraine this has not been formalized, but we actually do have co-regulation. And I'll give you some real examples of that. At the end of last year, we had major media holdings, and the regulator, the national over the body that worked with media organizations, as elaborate a joint so-called act or document that focused on developing the rules of broadcasting and producing dealing with children who had been victims of sexual violence. It's not war or conflict, but it's an important topic for the media, because in the media we had certain scandals and problems with regard to interviewing or covering children in the media. So this is a joint document that was signed by all media groups except for one, Intera. They didn't sign it. So this is a good example of co-regulation, and I think that this is quite promising in the future. Do I have 2 more minutes, if I may? Or 1 minute?
I want to give a minute to Bent, and then don't want to overstretch the patience of our translators.
Okay.
Bent, you from outside, the last word.
Okay. Very shortly, I think this was an excellent example of the benefit from working together across conflict sites. The statement we just heard here, I think the Cyprus collaboration was an excellent example of that. I believe strongly that you need to work across the sides of the conflict, and of course, all the self-regulation you can make in journalist associations, in media houses and whatever is of course only good, but be sure that the pressure on the politicians, who are those who create conflicts, it's not journalists who create conflicts. The pressure on the politicians to respect your independence will be bigger if you work together across conflict boundaries. That's all. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you all for your valuable contributions from the panel, from the discussants, from the plenary, and thanks as well for the interpreters. Have a good lunch break. Thank you.